Wise, to kick off the session today, what I thought that I would do, one of the nice things about being able to spend 3 weeks together is that we have conversations that thread themselves together over time. And so, both based on the conversations that we've had in the workshop, but then also private conversations that I and Jennifer have had with a number of you. I told Jennifer to stay at home today because I didn't think we'd have enough space. I don't know if people saw the room next door, but it's tiny, so that's why she's not here. But we combined just a kind of set of themes that we thought would be helpful to connect some of the dots, and then I'm going to dive into the material for today. So the first thing is that I think that there's been a series of questions regarding how to engage with cultural production writ large, whether or not it's art and culture or theoretical work, and that one of the issues has to do with a certain form of reductivism that is quite widespread within the bourgeois humanities, within disciplines like philosophy, art history, and other humanities disciplines, in which there's a concentration on the cultural artifact at the expense of the social relations of production, distribution, and consumption of that artifact. So you take the entire social world and you reduce it only to a text or a painting or a film. In doing that, there's a reductivism that actually manifests what can be theoretically articulated as cultural commodity fetishism. If you're familiar with the concept of commodity fetishism, it indexes the way in which in capitalist society, commodities are fetishized by delinking them from the entire network of their production and the logics and the material relations that go into not only how they're produced, but also how they circulate. Classic examples of these would be the fetishization of the latest iPhone without recognizing where the minerals come from, where the near slave labor that produces them comes from, and all of the global social relations of labor that go into producing the fetishized commodity. So just as there is commodity fetishism within consumer capitalist society, within the bourgeois humanities, there's a tendency reductively to rely on cultural commodity fetishism, in which you fetishize, for instance, the text of an individual thinker, or the cult of personality of the thinker in question. And even raising the question in certain instances of how that thinker or that text relates to the broader social world is then itself criticized as being reductivist, as if there's something magical about the text or the cultural product, which is a commodity. It's just a cultural commodity. And that magical property can't be then connected to the material set of relations that actually produce it. In other words, what I'm encouraging us to all be able to see is that just as within the world of the consumer world of capitalism, there's commodity fetishism, these same basic fundamental structures are also operative in the theoretical world and in the world of high culture. There's a tendency within the theoretical work on high culture to presume that high culture doesn't function by the same rules as broader consumer culture, which is simply itself a result of an elevation of certain forms of cultural production above the general capitalist relations within which they are situated. The other thing that I wanted to mention, there's just a few bullet points, and then I'll dive into the material for today, is that I think that sometimes, and I was exposed to this in my student years, that when people refer to Marxism or historical and dialectical materialism, there's a click that kind of goes off in the brain where one assumes that, well, this is this old school dogmatic thing that is kind of boring and has been refuted by these new sophisticated theories that have overcome all of their limitations. And that affective ideology, because that's ultimately what it is. It's an ideology about affects and sentiments, where one would kind of think, well, this isn't cool and trendy and sexy, it's therefore boring and old school, when in fact, one could argue that it's exactly the opposite, insofar as the nature of one's theoretical production changes considerably depending on the way in which that theoretical practice is articulated within a broader intellectual community. And the dominant theoretical practice within the bourgeois humanities, and even the bourgeois social sciences for that matter, is one in which one privileges individual, idiosyncratic way of thinking and speaking so that you can compete in the marketplace of ideas and you can sell yourself. And that's what professionalization is all about. You know, I'm a Deleuzian, or I'm the person who made the connections between Peru and, the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and this is my little niche, and that's how I'm going to market myself in the broader world. Now, those market forces, one can be critical of them while recognizing full well that they exist. So I have no naivete whatsoever, and I don't think that we can just wish them away or assume that they're going to disappear. Anyone who wants to get a job in the capitalist academy needs to deal with them. And I think it would be simply dismissive to say that, well, we'll just get rid of them and abolish them and think they don't exist. That is not the position that I think makes the most sense. But I do think, coming back to the first point, that it's integral to recognize that if you have a theoretical practice in which you want to do intellectual work that's useful, that's helpful for understanding and hopefully improving the world, then one of the most exciting things is to get connected to a community that does that. Because it's not a community of individual competition, in which I'm sure some of you have been to academic conferences in which everybody's got their little, commodity that they're selling. They're competing with one another. You go to academic panels, nobody listens to one another. You go to the bar afterwards and everybody's selling their product and everybody's talking about who they know and what their connections are. There's an opportunism, an individualism, and a competitiveness that is rank within that broader academic world, and it's actually quite inimical to the production of a collective ethos in which you feel part of something and excited about something other than selling or trying to sell, because unfortunately the academic market now, nobody's buying, right? So it's a good time to stop trying to sell, because it's collapsing and being destroyed at the same time by various forces. What's exciting about the historical and dialectical materialist tradition is you can plug into a world of knowledge and learn about everything. You don't have to become the tiny little specialist who's working on footnotes, from 19th century French literature. You can be the person who's understanding politics in contemporary Thailand, the political economy of Peru, racism in South Africa. You can begin to understand everything and how, most importantly, it's all connected within a broader complex of forces. So there's something very exciting about being able to participate in those types of relations. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there were questions about the kind of value of French theory, particularly after the discussion last time. And I do think that the approach to bourgeois culture in general, because French theory is a manifestation of bourgeois culture, is that anything that can be found of value in it should be, taken, engaged in, worked through. And it's also important to recognize that there is a symbolic economy that's operative within the intellectual world. That means that French theory does have use value if, for instance, you want to get a job in certain sectors. Just like all of the theoretical discourses coming out of or inspired by French theory have a certain use value within the symbolic economy of the Imperial Academy. If you know decolonial theory, subaltern studies, these different discourses, they have traction in the Imperial Academy, and they have use value within that symbolic economy. And as I was mentioning just a moment ago, if you want to gain traction within those worlds, being conversant in those discourses is a very, very good idea. Being conversant in them, though, doesn't mean that you have to accept the ideological baggage that comes with them, because one of the reasons that they have traction in this world is precisely because they do not have traction in the broader world. And seeing the connection between the academic system and the deep history of imperialism is essential. What is promoted within the Imperial Academy is not the set of theoretical tools that would allow people to dismantle imperialism. On the contrary, what is on offer within the Imperial Academy, what is promoted, is precisely a way of thinking that is not dangerous to the capitalist ruling class and imperialist interests. Doesn't take a genius to figure that out, right? And Stephen's question, actually, that we didn't get to last time, is what about the repression that's been unleashed on those people who truly think otherwise, if we can use the kind of trendy language that's used. These are the people who have been excluded from the academy. People like Michael Parenti, arguably one of the most important US American thinkers of the 20th and early 21st century, never had an academic job that was stable. Right? George Jackson, killed in prison. Walter Rodney, assassinated by the Guyanese state in a car bombing at a very, very young age. Probably one of the single best historians of the contemporary age. Now, I'm not encouraging anyone to get killed in a car bombing, of course, or to get incarcerated. But you have to be able to see that the logic of the Imperial Academy is such that promotion and repression are two sides of the same fundamental orientation. People who own the means of intellectual production do not want knowledge that is a true threat to power and property. Therefore, the whole system is set up to insulate itself against that. Fortunately, there is a margin of maneuver within the Imperial Academy. There is a general discourse concerning a meritocracy and the autonomy of the intellectual sphere and other such things. So there's space within the interstices of the larger academy to do things that are interesting and to push the envelope. And so it's also important to recognize that there's a kind of gray scale. It's not all black and white. It's not because, oh, somebody's an academic, therefore they're completely compromised, or somebody got a grant and therefore, they're just doing the work of the capitalist ruling class. There is a force field that is ultimately controlled at the level of the base by the people who own the means of intellectual production, circulation, and consumption. But within that system, there's still a lot of space that can be leveraged for interesting and important work. So these were just some opening comments. I'm just going to close this. I think it's a lot cooler in here than out there. So, and I don't want everybody out there to listen to what I'm going to post on YouTube, I guess. Going into the work for today, though, what I wanted to share with you was a part of a long-standing research project that has, Emmerich mentioned this. It was originally a book that I wrote in French that was dealing with the relationship between bourgeois states, and in particular the US state apparatus, the capitalist ruling class, and in particular the imperialist ruling class in the United States, and the intelligentsia. Meaning the military, military, industrial, academic complex. Military indexing the state, industrial referring to the capitalist ruling class, and academic referring to the intellectual world. In my decades of research on the topic, it became increasingly clear that the ivory tower doesn't exist. There isn't a university distinct from the broader social, economic, and political world. But on the contrary, the world of intellectual production is absolutely essential to the way in which capitalist governance, particularly in the heart of the empire, operates. Because if you can control the intellectual middle stratum, professors, journalists, pundits, etc., these are the mind managers of the masses. And if you can dictate the dominant ways of thinking to this middle stratum, then you're a long way to controlling the minds of the masses. And in my research, it became apparent the extent to which this system functions as a kind of organic system in which a lot of the intellectual work that's done in the academy is driven by a set of interests that needs to be brought further to the fore because of the assumption that intellectual work is just autonomous. It's the result of individual free thinking and the marketplace of ideas, and the best ideas win, and that's just how the world of thinking works. In order to understand this kind of broader spectrum, I think it's helpful to elucidate the context within which the dominant theoretical traditions of the late 20th and early 21st century emerged. And that was that if we look at the early 20th century in the capitalist core, is this somebody looking for us? Come on in. Yeah, come on in. Just close the door behind you. Yeah. The United States emerged from the inter-imperialist rivalry of World War I and World War II as the leading imperial power. But they arrived at a particularly bad time in history for capitalism. World War I had, in part, led to or helped instigate the Russian Revolution. World War II helped instigate the uprisings of the colonies and the decolonial revolutions that swept the world in the 1950s and 1960s. So the US inherited the crown of imperialism at a point in time when imperialism was on its heels, and, even worse, communism in the 1940s arguably had the greatest public credibility perhaps in history. Because who shut down Auschwitz? It was the Red Army. Who stopped the fascist takeover in Europe and across Southeast Asia? It was the communists. In that regard, communism benefited from an incredible public credibility, something that's almost impossible to imagine today, especially for my generation and your generation, a moment in which you have rising fascism and rank anti-communism being promoted left, right, and center. So the problem with the ideological project of the United States in the immediate post-war era is that they had to change that narrative as quickly as possible. And it's important to note that this was at a time when between about 1943 and 1945, if you study US American culture from that point in time, look at movies like Mission to Moscow, a Hollywood production that was not just pro-communist, it was pro-Stalin. And it's a fantastic document that's based on the diaries of the diplomat to the Soviet Union and took positions that are completely anathema to U.S.-style anti-communism. And so one of the fundamental projects of the U.S. state in the immediate wake of World War II was to change that narrative. And there were basically two prongs to that project. One was repression. And the McCarthy era, which was picking up on the red purges of the teens, 20s, and 30s, sought to crush organized leftism, chase out professors from the university, labeling anyone who was a member of a communist party as incapable of teaching in the university because they were not free thinkers. They were just apparatchiks who didn't think for themselves. The repressive apparatus was extremely important and is very well documented. What is less well documented, in my opinion, is the extent to which they also engaged in a hegemonic war, meaning a war for the ideological demolition of the socialist alternative in the name of shoring up what Thomas Brayton of the Central Intelligence Agency refers to as the compatible left intelligentsia. The goal was very, very smart, that communism was so widespread, so widely accepted. Right? Langston Hughes was writing hymns to Lenin. Paul Robeson was a self-proclaimed communist. Pablo Picasso, arguably the most famous artist in the history of the Western world. What were his politics? He was a communist. Pablo Neruda, a communist. They were all over. Communists were everywhere. So what you needed to do, because it wasn't possible to take Marxism off the table, what you needed to do is shore up a version of leftism that presented itself as being radical, interested in left projects, but ultimately anti-communist. And so the distinction that the Central Intelligence Agency and the US state in general uses is between the compatible and the incompatible left. Compatible left is a form of leftism that's either progressive liberal, anarchist, or kind of libertarian socialist, or other versions thereof, that at the end of the day, they'll have many criticisms of capitalism, say that we should probably get rid of it, maybe even call for its abolition now, immediately, by burning it down. But they won't be organized in such a manner that they constitute a real threat to its interests. And therefore, if they accept the fundamental guiding principle of rejecting socialism in reality, they end up being capitalist accommodationists, and often even imperialist accommodationists. So the soft sell approach was the way it was done in the early Cold War years. Meaning, let's not come out and try to make the intelligentsia into right-wing ideologues. That's a lost cause. Let's say, you can be a leftist, you can be a radical, but on one condition. Your radicality doesn't have traction in the real world of socialist state building projects that are anti-imperialist. We need you to be on our side of that fundamental dividing line. And they funneled an incredible amount of money into this project. Millions and millions of dollars. So much so that Frank Wisner of the CIA referred to it as candy. It was candy because it was a free-for-all and they had all of the money that they could ever want. They funded political parties, unions, civic associations, women's groups, anti-racial organizing groups, intellectuals, journalists. The list goes on and on and on. It's truly astounding when you actually see some of the ledgers for everything that they contributed. In that regard, then, part of the way in which the dominant radical intelligentsia that rose to prominence within the imperial core in the post-war era needs to be understood is that in the kind of cultural Cold War that was taking place, they had there was a kind of confluence of interests, if you will, between the leading philosophic and intellectual schools that were putting forth purportedly radical ways of thinking and the interests of the capitalist ruling class and the state managers who ultimately wanted to shore up, through soft power mechanisms, a compatible left intelligentsia. It's that organic link between the kind of opportunism of the radical left intelligentsia and the interests of the capitalist ruling class and their state managers that goes a very long way to explaining what is generally referred to as the marketplace of ideas or the meritocracy that is purportedly operative within the intellectual world. Within that framework, what I wanted to focus on more specifically, that's the kind of big picture overview, is the way in which the major foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, are referred to as the big three. The foundations, you should know, are simply, they're cutouts from the corporations. And the history of foundations is a complex one that we could discuss in the Q&A if you want. But in short, it was an opportunity for the major corporations of the capitalist ruling class to withhold their wealth from taxation by putting it in the foundations. And then they used the foundation money to engage in soft power projects and fund what they want to fund, which will serve their interests. So foundation money is sometimes referred to as twice stolen wealth. First, the corporations steal it from the workers through exploitation. Then, with all of their profits, they steal it a second time because they don't give it to the government through taxation, and at least in principle, taxation is supposed to, of course, it just goes to the military-industrial complex, but it's supposed to go back to the workers in various ways by, supporting infrastructure projects and things like this. So that twice stolen wealth is then leveraged in the direction of soft power projects by funding whatever it is that the capitalist ruling class finds particularly useful. The big three, like the foundations in general, have worked hand in glove with the US state and in particular the Central Intelligence Agency on these projects. I mentioned this before, but the confluence between the two is such that they are more or less seamless. They're different organizations, but in the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, you have liaisons with the Central Intelligence Agency. You have regular conversations between the two. They jointly fund projects. They work together. So one shouldn't get hung up on, the CIA is this special mysterious thing and it's conspiratorial and therefore it's of a different register than everything else. No, the CIA is one agency among many other agencies within a state apparatus that is a bourgeois state that works with a capitalist ruling class and their foundations on projects of psychological warfare, among other things. Within these projects of psychological warfare, one of the most interesting things, and this is what I wanted to focus on today, that I found in my research, because I've done a lot of archival research. Someone was asking me the other day about where I got some of the documents that I shared with you. I've done a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, getting documents directly from the government. There's a lot of online digital archives, increasingly so, which is great. I encourage everyone to look at the electronic reading room of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the Vault is the name of the online database of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But then I've also just consulted a lot of archives myself and taken photographs of a lot of the archival documents. And in the Rockefeller archive, there's a fascinating project. And when I first heard about it, I thought, wow, that's so strange. there's a project called the Marxism-Leninism Project. And the Rockefeller Foundation was funding to the tune of millions of dollars a project called Marxism-Leninism. And I thought, damn, like who is getting this money, right? And in digging into the way in which it operates, through the work of, actually, you had referenced the excellent book by Tim Müller. If anyone reads German, Kriege und Gelehrte is an excellent archival deep dive into the Rockefeller Foundation and its relationship to, in particular, German critical theory and some of the people involved in this project. One of the things that's remarkable about the Marxism-Leninism project is that the goal was to shore up a Marxist intelligentsia, self-proclaimed Marxist intelligentsia, that knew Marxism-Leninism within all of the internal documents of the U.S. State, and not all, but it's a general refrain within the U.S. state. The true enemy isn't just Marxism, it's Marxism-Leninism, because Marxism-Leninism is identified as the particular form of Marxism that brought about the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, that was a driving force behind the Cuban Revolution, Vietnam, of course, on and on and on. So it's the most threatening version, and it's the one that they situated squarely in the crosshairs. So they wanted people who understood what Marxism-Leninism was and had an internal analysis of it, but they also, very importantly, wanted to shore up a version of Marxism that they referred to as authentic Marxism that could rival the Marxism of the East, because they recognized that so many people around the world were interested in Marxism. So they were reading works that were published by Moscow. They were consulting works directly from the Marxist-Leninists of the East. They wanted to, and they had the resources to do so, lay their hands on it so that they could own and control what Marxism was and what Marxism people had access to. The idea of authentic Marxism was the principle according to which there are foundational principles of Marxism, and that they were perverted. They were perverted by these barbarous, non-thinking people in the East who weren't sophisticated like the Western intelligentsia, and who had taken Marx and Marxism and perverted it by turning it into a kind of authoritarian, totalitarian, gulag-driven hellscape. And so what we needed to do is go back to the original texts of Marx, interpret them correctly, and shore up a version of Marxism that demonstrated that the Marxism put in practice in the East was to be condemned, while at the same time building up a Marxist intelligentsia that presented itself as more cutting edge, more sophisticated, more complex, more refined than the Leninists in the East. At the absolute center of this project happens to be one of the most famous Western Marxists of the 20th century, a man by the name of Herbert Marcuse, a man who, in the first generation of the Frankfurt School, is identified as one of the few members of the Frankfurt School who was a true radical. In the sense that most people know Adorno and Horkheimer were rabidly opposed to actually existing socialism in every way, shape, and form. Horkheimer even supported the war in Vietnam and said that the United States, when they go to war to defend the rights of man, and we should know that. So taking a kind of human rights discourse and democracy promotion discourse that has not gone away, Adorno is known for a number of things, none of which have to do with supporting revolutionary political orientation, but Marcuse was radicalized in the 1960s and became what was known as the godfather of the New Left. He was a very prominent public spokesperson who came out in the 60s, and following, as somebody who was opposed to the war in Vietnam. He supported the student movement. He supported certain elements of the black radical movement. He supported the women's movement. He supported the ecological movement. And he was part of a kind of new left orientation that was anti-communist, for sure. He remained an anti-communist to the end of his life, but he was a self-proclaimed radical, and he did have, if you read, as I have, his FBI file, he had the FBI on his tail at the end of his life, and he also ultimately was squeezed out of his academic job for the political positions that he was taking. But if we rewind just a little bit and ask ourselves, well, where did Marcuse come from, and how is it that he became the godfather of the New Left, promoted endlessly by the bourgeois press, as opposed to someone like George Jackson, who ended up being killed in prison? Well, Herbert Marcuse worked for years for the Office of Strategic Services, which is a predecessor organization of the CIA, and then the State Department. When interviewed about this work, he said repeatedly, I had nothing to do with the CIA. The OSS and the CIA fought each other like mortal enemies, which is actually impossible because the OSS was folded up in 1945 and closed shop. The CIA was launched in 1947, so I don't know how they were fighting each other because they never existed at the same time. And then I came across State Department documents that demonstrate that the job description of Herbert Marcuse was to develop intelligence for the intelligence community of the United States, including for the Central Intelligence Agency. And other archival research by Tim Mueller has demonstrated that Marcuse was actually a top-level State Department agent who was considered one of the world leaders on communism, and he was so high in the State Department that he was involved in drafting 2 national intelligence estimates, which Emmerich mentioned. These are the highest form of intelligence for the entire intelligence community of the US government. So Marcuse wasn't just fighting Nazis in the OSS, as is the standard line. He was actually a major anti-communist intellectual working with the State Department for years. And then when he moved into the university, what he actually did was just accompany the division of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, that had then been moved into the State Department in the post-war era, that focused on the Soviet Union, was relocated in the post-war era. And it was moved to the Russian Institute at Columbia, and the Russian Research Center at Harvard was also another outcropping of it. In both of these institutions, these were set up with funding and support from the capitalist ruling class, and the Central Intelligence Agency was involved. What they wanted was to own Sovietology. They wanted a form of studying, or a way of studying, the Soviet Union that was owned, controlled, and overseen by the US state and the capitalist ruling class. So Marcuse was the principal intellectual at the core of the Rockefellers' Marxism-Leninism project, along with Isaiah Berlin. I don't know if anyone knows Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin was also an intelligence man. He comes directly out of British intelligence and was actually working in the United States during this time, is known as a rabid anti-communist. You should actually read some of the things that he says about communism. It's like remarkable. There's no one more genocidal than the communists, according to Isaiah Berlin. He was one of the other kind of intellectual kingpins. And what they did with the Marxism-Leninism project is, with the intellectual kingpins of people like Marcuse and Isaiah Berlin, they set up an international architecture for Western Marxist research. They had institutes in Berlin, in Freiburg. This institution in France was not directly involved in the Marxism-Leninism Institute, but was in the second orbit out, if you will, through the connections particularly to a number of intellectuals here. Lucien Goldman was involved in the Marxism-Leninism project, for instance. They also had an institute in Amsterdam, and worked closely with a series of universities in the United States: Columbia, Bryn Mawr, that's close to Villanova, University of Kansas, and other places. With this international architecture, they had funding. Again, this is to the tunes of millions of dollars in the 1950s and 1960s. And this is a lot of money to run international conferences, support doctoral research, support intellectual exchanges, enormous publication projects, including editing works from the East. So you had Philip Mosley, who's known as the organizational man. Philip Mosley was a long-time, high-level CIA consultant involved in the Princeton Group, which was a group of intellectuals who worked directly with the top tier of the Central Intelligence Agency in producing national intelligence estimates. Philip Mosley was involved in this. He was really one of the core organizational figures within the Marxism-Leninism project. And the funding that they had was then also for these publications, and you have people like Moseley and those around Moseley who are actually then getting funded for producing, for instance, indexes to Stalin's works that are published in the West. All of this was done in such a way that it wasn't announced that, hey, the capitalist ruling class is attempting to take over the field of Marxism and leverage power away from the East and promote a version of Marxism that's compatible with imperial and capitalist interests, right? None of that was stated. What was stated is that there is an international network of Marxist scholarship that is supported because it's a meritocracy, and what we're seeking is the enhancement of knowledge. What the Marxism-Leninism project ended up doing, and the kind of consequences for it, was shoring up precisely the forms of Western Marxism that would become hegemonic in the post-war era. And so one very important element of the way in which I think we need to understand the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which many people take to be foundational within the tradition of Western Marxism, is that the Frankfurt School was deeply, deeply allied with the military, industrial, academic complex. Right? Marcuse is only one example of this. The Frankfurt School, the first generation, if people aren't familiar with it, was relocated to the United States during World War II with the rise of fascism in Germany. Horkheimer and Adorno had access to the money of a well-known capitalist, Felix Weil, in order to set up this Marxist institute. And in the very, very early years, people like Lukács and others participated, and it did have some kind of workers' orientation. But very quickly, particularly within the US context, it became invested in doing the type of work that could garner support from the new patrons in the West. And so Adorno came over to the United States funded by the Rockefellers. And he was working on the Princeton Radio Project, which was a Rockefeller-funded project, doing research that was clearly and directly linked to the goals of psychological warfare operations by studying the consequences for certain forms of radio production on the spread of propaganda. The Rockefellers continued then to work closely with and support the Institute for Social Research, as it was known officially, throughout its life. They supported its move back to West Germany after the war, including support directly to Horkheimer himself for a professorship there. And they worked with other interests within the capitalist ruling class and within both the West European state and the US state to continue supporting the Frankfurt School as one of the very important reference points within the kind of second orbit out of the Marxism-Leninism project. So the core orbit is the one that I just mentioned of these institutions in Europe and a few of them in the United States. But just in the next concentric circle out, you have the Institute for Social Research, which is regularly cited in internal documents as being an ally in a lot of these projects, and what was originally the École pratique des hautes études, the sixth section of it, that became in 1975 the École des études en sciences sociales, which is the institution that we're currently sitting in. And this building and the funding for it came from Rockefeller and from Ford. All of this was in an endeavor to then shore up and promote a version of Marxism that could be palatable so that intellectuals could say, we're Marxists. And we're not only Marxists, we're real Marxists. We're the authentic Marxists who really know how to read and study Marx in a sophisticated, complex manner. We have access to all of the erudite editions of Marx and Engels' complete works and all of the other complete works, all of the translations. But we see through the propaganda of the East because we understand that what has happened in the East and in actually existing socialism is a perversion of Marxism's kind of real driving spirit. In that regard, I think that if you want to understand the contemporary intelligentsia and the consequences of what was done both in relationship to the Institute for Social Research and French-style structuralism that eventually became French theory that we were talking about yesterday, you have to understand the broader spectrum of the political economy of knowledge production, who's paying for what and why, as well as the way in which intellectual research is situated within global class struggle. Because the world that we've inherited, the world that I was educated in, is a world that is a consequence of that. So much so that in the contemporary world, the institutional patterns that were established in the early Cold War and during the Cultural Cold War became so strong and so powerful that they have their own internal inertia. Right? Luke, you had asked a question the first day, right, about how we can relate decolonial theory to some of these earlier developments. When you look at contemporary radical theory, like decolonial theory would be one example among many others, Afro-pessimism, there's a lot of other examples one could point to. In these cases, as far as I know, there's no direct connection, for instance, between these movements and something like the Central Intelligence Agency. There is a lot of foundation money, and the Mellon Foundation has taken over a lot of the funding that was earlier done by the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegies, although the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie are still very, very involved. There's a number of connections between the Mellon Foundation and contemporary radical theorists, in particular, kind of radical liberal queer theory. But there are other interests as well. So those traditions continue of capitalist ruling class funding the work that supports their interests, but there's also, very importantly, institutional inertia. Once you set up a system, the ideal situation is for that system to function on its own. All that you need to do is you recruit a new generation of professors who are already indoctrinated in the same fundamental worldviews, who are going to vet the next generation. And you get the system to function on its own without needing to have any strings attached or any oversight. That's the best possible situation. Right? In that regard, I think that this broader framework, I think, goes a long way to then explaining why it is that the forms of radical theory that one is generally exposed to within the imperial core have a very explicit political orientation that is usually not announced as such. So in my own kind of education, one of the processes that I've had to go through is one of a profound self-critique. And this is the last thing that I'll say, and then we'll open up for questions, comments, criticisms, etc. Is that I was interested as a young person in finding theory that had use value and was radical, in the sense that, I grew up in an environment where I did a lot more labor, manual labor, than intellectual labor for my whole life. And it was grueling, and I wanted to find a way of overcoming that, not only for myself, but also all the other people that I was working with in farm work and construction work. Also, being exposed to very viscerally and existentially the ways in which, in particular, women and racialized groups were not only exposed to exploitation, but super exploitation and deep forms of oppression. I wanted theory that could actually address these issues and make a difference in the world. And in going to US universities in the 1990s, I was told basically, well, there's this Marxism of the Frankfurt School, and there's French theory that is radicalizing Marxism to such an extent that it's overcoming it and questioning all of its fundamental presuppositions and opening up these new horizons of thought. And so I thought, well, I should go in that direction. And given that, I don't come from an elite background, I didn't have any of the kind of tools for figuring out what was useful and what was not. I figured, well, the whole institution is saying this stuff is radical, correct, cutting edge. I've got to learn it. And if I want to do it well, I should learn all the languages and I should go to the source. And so I came here to study with Derrida originally, and then ended up studying with Badiou and other people like that, Balibar, etc., because I wanted to get to the core of what this French radical tradition was, all the while engaging in both German critical theory and US American critical theory. And it's only a long process of recognizing that I didn't have the intellectual capability of understanding what are arguably the most important things in the world. Right? We live in a world where it's code red for humanity. All of us in this room might still be alive when there's no longer any human life on planet Earth. That's according to the UN projections of the ecological collapse. That needs to be combined with nuclear apocalypse, which is right around the corner and could be any moment. On top of that, the global disparities in wealth are sharper than they ever have been in the entire history of humanity. We have what some theorists refer to as the trifurcation of humanity. We have the capitalist ruling class that have their shelters and they're very comfortable. You have a tiny swath of the population, a very, very small percentage of the population that can live, eat, have housing, access to water, access to electricity. It's something like 80% of planet Earth that does not have that. That trifurcation of humanity means that we are right now inhabiting a world where most people can barely live, and there's rampant social murder, meaning people's lives are shortened because of pollution, not access to drinkable water, not access to vaccines and other such things. All of this means that the stakes of class struggle are higher than they ever have been. And so in that world, I couldn't just keep going on in the direction of being able to out Derrida somebody because I speak French and know what différance is and can deconstruct the history of Western metaphysics and have these types of discourses. I felt like early in my life, I knew so much about things that matter so little to the overwhelming majority of the population. And even more importantly, I knew so little about the things that matter most to everyone on planet Earth. Those are things like ecocide, imperialism, global racism, global misogynistic destruction, and social murder. Those are the forces that are driving this world, and those are the forces that we need to get together and work together to try to both understand and transform. And so in my case, it was very painful, very counterproductive in terms of my career, because of the consequences that one pays for reorienting one's intellectual horizons. But, and this is, I guess, my final message, there can be nothing better than because there's a lot of smart people in this room, a lot of very smart people, to mobilize the intellectual power that you have and put it in the service of improving the world for us all, because if we don't do it, it's lights out for everybody. And in that regard, coming to terms in difficult ways with all of this history, I think is important, because what we need is a reorientation. We have to move from a world in which the compatible left has become the dominant ideology to a world in which all options are on the table, and we look at every possibility for the future of humanity. We've been under 5 centuries of capitalism. Look where it got us. Super developed parts of the world, no doubt. But life expectancy in the United States has been going down, particularly during the COVID crisis. Infrastructure is crumbling, just to index that example. The imperial core is coming apart at the seams. Fascism is arising everywhere. They're attacking and destroying the university and the journalistic world because they don't want people to think. The problem is that the world is radicalizing people, and they don't want that. The reason the world is radicalizing people is that one of the most exciting things in my generation is currently happening, and that is that the rise of the global south is a reality that can no longer be denied, in the sense that there's a multipolar emergence, a multipolar world that is stretching, testing, and in certain cases breaking the world historical chains of imperialism that have been in place for 5 centuries. It's an incredibly exciting time to be alive, as terrifying as it is. It's a very, very exciting time to be alive, because the world dynamic is shifting. It's not shifting, overnight, but at times there are moments where there's a real kind of displacement of sorts. And so getting plugged into that, understanding the world that we live in, and orienting ourselves appropriately, I think is the most important thing that we can do. So I'm going to stop here, and we can use the raised hand function online if there are questions from the online people. And here I can just maybe take stack, so the floor is yours. We'll just do the same thing as we have in the past, which is 4 or 5 questions. I'll try to keep it brief so we get as many people in as possible. I think Millie in the back. Oh yeah, sorry. And Seema is on it more than I am. Thank you. Oh, does anyone have regular telephone service and would be able to join the Zoom call and share their telephone with the people who are speaking to ask questions? No? Well, can you get online and could you get on the Zoom call and not be billed $1,000?
I think so. I have free. The service is called free.
Okay.
Is that one that's bigger for this?
Would you mind seeing if you could get on our Zoom call?
If somebody wants to do it for me and test it, I mean, well, I'll give it to you.
Okay.
Select somebody else, and you just,
Is it live? Is it, yeah. But go ahead. Is it Millie who's starting? Did somebody? I think Millie in the back.
Yeah.
Were you going to kick it off?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have two questions. I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, but feel free to cut me off if I sort of ramble on. First of all, I'm interested in asking what you understand to be socialism in the 21st century. In my experience and understanding, there exists today, by virtue, of course, of general efforts to disseminate any form of political opposition to the right-wing authoritarian populism, no international left. Simultaneously, the failures of the left can be, to a certain extent, attributed to the fact that today we lack a uniting radical leftist vision, akin to the ones that historically allowed socialism to be tellurically established as a mode of governance. And I wonder here whether, I'm genuinely curious what you understand to be that radical leftist vision, which has the potential of uniting us all in this form of opposition that you're supporting. And then my other question, which might be by the virtue of my own misunderstanding, is I wonder about the division of labor specifically within the context of the academy, and about whether scholarship that is of a distinctly apolitical character ought to be sort of discredited or seen as less important in this time of political turmoil. I'm thinking here of, scholarship that's devoted to the study of the particular and of the abstract, such as literary studies, things that aren't directly sort of politically energetic. I'm thinking here specifically of your discussion of feminist thinkers such as Julia Kristeva and Hélène Cixous in the context of yesterday's reading. Mm-hmm. And I wonder because although they might not pave the path toward or imagine a sort of radical leftist vision, they remain pertinent to the study of the feminine. I'm thinking here specifically of gender-based violence in the context of the USSR, and how even though there was a sort of radicalizing of gender-based relations in the context of government and legislation, there was still the reproductive labor of women was still legislated and enforced upon to make up for sort of a population deficit. There was still distinct instances of gender-based violence and difference in the treatment of women, precisely because the purging of ideology within had not sort of completely taken place. And I wonder whether it is thinkers such as that are devoted to such studies of the particular that help us to sort of engage in that questioning of where we stand in relation to ideology on the psychical level. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
I'm curious, because you kind of hinted at an answer, but I wasn't totally satisfied with it. Why you think the intensification? Why are political elites no longer interested in funding this controlled opposition? Because you said it's because they don't want people to think, right? But I can imagine the same response in the immediate post-war era. And instead you saw kind of the opposite. So what do you have a theory as to why they're taking this approach rather than a kind of maybe renewed McCarthyism, maybe, where there was very intense funding paired with political repression?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, given that so many, we are in a university setting right now, and so many of us come from these highly quote unquote educated backgrounds. Do you agree with the stance that I think Fred Moten made, that the only ethical or possible relation to the university is one of theft? How do you view your own position in a university in high bourgeois academia? And how do you view the future of positions in the academy with a horizon of revolutionary liberation?
I would like to understand a little bit more your position in relationship to, what we saw in Latin America as the pink wave. And I'm particularly interested in, we have, for example, in Brazil, Lula, no, but there's also certain cooperations that him or even, Petro in Colombia, different geopolitical manifestations that are carried out. And I think that in one way, they're working or having to engage with certain, this sort of NGO complex, right? And so how do we make sense of these left governments where in one way they do actually provide a lot of material support for working class people? The PT in and of itself came about as a workers and a union movement overall in the 80s. And also, I guess part of my question too is how do we contend that history with the internal colonialism that occurs, particularly, yes, within a Latin American context, but I think that when we study revolutionary movements or workers' movements in the global South, it could be pertinent to also analyze that in overall.
Should we take one more?
So you have argued that foundations such as the Rockefeller Fund would put all this effort into containing the left, and I think that's probably been quite effective up until the Trump era in the United States. But now we see actually such a strong anti-intellectualism. So why is there such a backlash, and not just popular, but institutional, against cultural Marxism when it's been so effective at containing genuine political action? Like thinking, for example, Vance's comment, it was a couple months ago now, that the enemy's within. Well, he's talking about cultural Marxists that are really not even potent anyway. Yeah. So why is he saying this in this sort of neo-McCarthyism?
Great questions. They're very capacious, so every one of them could take an hour. I'll just start from the top and try to give the core of the response. Socialism in the 21st century, I think, looks a lot like what countries where the state apparatus is in control of the general and broad working class. And there aren't a lot of states in the world like that currently. I am of those who understand what's going on in China as a socialist project, in Vietnam, in Cuba, Nicaragua is slightly different. Venezuela is slightly different insofar as both in Nicaragua and in Venezuela they still maintain electoral cycles and things like this, and so there's an opposition, and so it's a little bit different, the level of control. But in these examples and others that one could point to, there is a project of taking the value generated by workers and instead of allowing the capitalist ruling class to use that value as profit, finding different mechanisms to redistribute the value produced by workers to the workers themselves in the form of free or affordable healthcare, education, housing, right to employment. Right to cultural development is very essential, right? You don't just want people who have the basics. You want people who are being educated and have access to art and culture and things like this. And very importantly, you want an ecological environment, not a degraded environment. Anybody who travels somewhere in certain areas, at least, of China knows the extent to which their ecological civilization, the largest reforestation project in the history of humanity, they are the vanguard of the ecological revolution. I don't think there is any doubt, or if there is, that should stop soon if you study what's going on in contemporary China. But you're absolutely right, Millie. This is very different age than, for instance, the Cold War, in which there was a consolidated socialist bloc in which 2/5 of the world's population was living under a self-declared socialist government. But what we do have in the broader world is a number of countries that have projects of national development in which they are done with the unipolar world. The unipolar world being the imperialist world order overseen by the United States and their junior partners, usually Western Europe, Australia, Japan, other places around the world. And in that regard, they are allying with places like China to develop international infrastructure through organizations like BRICS and others in order to provide a different way of organizing humanity on planet Earth. Is it perfect? Is it the horizon of our dreams? No, we shouldn't expect it to be. But is it actually pushing back very significantly against the global history of imperialism? Absolutely no doubt. And so what I see us in is we're still only in the baby steps of global socialism. Capitalism's been around for some 5 centuries. Socialism for about a century, with an incredible and enormous setback due to internal mistakes and external meddling. With the dismantling so many socialist countries at the end of the 80s and early 90s, right? It was both internal and external, the reasons for the various collapses. And so we don't have a unified left socialist world. What we do have is an emerging global leader, China, that is allying with national development projects in the name of an alternative international architecture that is anti-imperialist. That, for me, is very, very exciting. Concerning apolitical scholarship and whether or not it should just be discredited, I don't think any scholarship is apolitical in the sense that I did a study of apolitical, quote-unquote, art in the 1950s and 1960s, and it happened that it was funded and supported by the CIA because they were mobilizing apolitical art to present the West as being a free and open world in which everybody could be free to be apolitical. But that was a political project. So that's one point, but then the other is Cixous and Kristeva, I think, are examples of what I would classify as bourgeois feminism, and bourgeois feminism has made certain contributions in drawing attention to particular issues concerning gender violence, oppression, etc. But I think it's really global South feminism and socialist feminism that has not only identified the problems but also the solutions to those problems. And so if we're looking for people who have a resolute analysis of gender violence and gender oppression, I would look sooner to them than to people like Cixous and Kristeva. The case of gender violence in the USSR, I think it's important to recognize that one of the things that socialist state building projects inherit is not only the extreme violence of the imperialist system, but they also inherit societies that have been indoctrinated by centuries of capitalism. They inherit racism, homophobia, misogyny, patriarchy. It's great, it really makes you want to be a socialist. You barely can start your state and then you inherit all of this crap that you have to deal with. And so one of the quintessential aspects of socialist projects is the re-education of the citizenry and breaking with deep and entrenched forms of racism, misogyny, etc. The Cuban example is fantastic, right? Early on, there were some decisions, and Fidel himself said it, that they made in relationship to the homosexual community that they revised. And they said, this was a mistake. We were trying to protect homosexuals, but then we ended up separating them from the larger society. And now they have the Cinesex, which is an institution that is educating the general public to be accepting not only of queer and trans people, but of every form of gender and sexual performance one could imagine. And they now have in Cuba what just about everybody recognizes as the most progressive family code in the world. So socialism is a process of learning in many ways, not only the process of learning practically how to implement socialism, but also a process by which humanity learns to collectively, as much as possible, it's very difficult, to overcome transphobia, homophobia, all of the ills that have been inherited. And you can't do that overnight. The process of ideological recomposition takes time and is a collective process. So just looking at a particular country and say, shame on you, there's still racism, it's unfortunate, but it does take time. You need structural and material changes. You have to go to the root problems and change the social relations of production to get rid of these things, and you have to change mindsets. And it takes a lot of time. Dominique, right? Yeah. I appreciate your question. The approach that I have to the contemporary world is, I hope I wasn't misunderstood or I didn't express myself poorly. There's an inertia that is the result of the earlier forms that have been set up. But the capitalist ruling class still definitely intervenes and supports. The Mellon Foundation, which supports to the tune of millions of dollars contemporary critical theory, while at the same time being the single largest contributor to the Trump campaign, should say a lot about the state of contemporary politics. Right? It's the Mellon Scaife Foundation, Scaife being the particularly reactionary elements in that group. And so the capitalist ruling class and the foundations are still very, very operative. And so is the repressive mechanism of what people call neo-McCarthyism. I mean, we've seen professors getting fired, students getting arrested, on and on and on. And so I do think that what we see now is it's a different configuration of relations, but you have repression on the one hand, like brutal repression, and promotion on the other. It's just the configuration is somewhat different. And one of the reasons that the university is threatening is because due to a certain level of education and a concentrated mass of people, because we don't have a lot of factories in the United States, it is an important site of struggle. And so the organizing, for instance, against the genocide against the Palestinians is important, and the broader Israeli wars in the West Asia. And so they want to crack down on that, and they want to try to turn education into something that simply serves imperial interests. And it doesn't serve imperial interests when you have encampments that are, in favor of stopping a genocide. And so that's at least a quick point on that. My view in relationship to the academy, could we get a drink and talk about that after the session? I got hired because I'm a specialist in French theory, not because of the politics that I currently espouse. And I do think that the university is an incredibly powerful institution because it provides people with the material means of doing intellectual work. There's great work that's being done in the university. There are wonderful people who are involved, and there's a fantastic opportunity to build community and to work with other people on common projects. I don't think that the university is only there to be, that universities our only relationship to it should be theft. I mean, we're also, the person who's saying that is also getting paid by a university, and being stolen from because of exploitation. So I think that the relations are a little bit more complex than that. But we should be able to get from the universities as much as we can and use as much as we can from them, while recognizing as well the extreme limitations of universities. I mean, the horizons of a university are limited in many, many ways, but it's a longer question that we'd have to kind of unpack perhaps in personal conversation. The pink tide, or what some people refer to as the second pink wave in Latin America, I think is a very important development politically that needs to be put in dialogue with the kind of first wave, but then also situated both in relationship to the most powerful kind of extant socialist projects in Cuba, Nicaragua, and in Venezuela, as well as in relationship to the kind of international architecture that I was referring to earlier of the multipolar world. And there's, in the push to make a better world, there are different ways of doing that and different levels of engagement that often have various forms of compromise involved. And so the kind of social democratic projects in some of the pink wave countries that you're alluding to are obviously preferable to the right-wing projects or the fascistic projects. The fact that, Petro in Colombia is quite extraordinary because Colombia's been the Israel of Latin America for the United States for so long, and that makes an enormous, enormous difference. But the margin of maneuver is limited, like with Lula's party in Brazil. There's a lot of compromises that have had to go into that project, and there's a continuing working, with and against more right-wing forces. And so I think it's important to at once tactically support those social democratic projects while recognizing that strategically, if we really want to get to where we need to get, then we can't simply be caught in these kind of tactical compromises of sorts. We have to get to a point in which the right-wing fascistic forces are really held at bay, if not eliminated from the political spectrum, so that power can really be in the hands of the workers. And we're not there in Brazil or in Colombia, but we're definitely closer than we would otherwise be. So I think it's always important politically to have a kind of dialectical analysis of the different levels and of the relationship between kind of tactics and strategies. The last question about cultural Marxism, I'm really happy that you highlighted this, because given my critiques of Western Marxism, and I've done a lot of work recently with John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review on this topic, there's a facile way in which one can assume that, well, Rockhill's critical of Western Marxists, the fascist or right-wing forces are critical of cultural Marxism, they agree, they're doing the same thing, That is not the case for a lot of reasons. The single most important one is that the history that I've charted out, basically of the shoring up of the compatible left intelligentsia as a weapon of war against the non-compatible left, what we're living through now, particularly in the United States, is the consequences of that. That when the right-wing forces have shored up the compatible left, what they will do, and what they are currently doing, is waging war on the compatible left. Because what do you think these people want? They don't want any left. And so even the compatible left and cultural Marxism are identified as enemies. Because at the end of the day, like, I'm critical of these people, but I'm critical of them because I want to bring them in my direction, not because I think that, some of the principles and some of the positions that they take are, Western Marxists tend to say capitalism is bad, misogyny is bad, racism is bad. It's just that the way they diagnose it and the solutions they put forth, I think, are incorrect and have been proven wrong by history. And so in that regard, it's the consequences of the shoring up of the compatible left that have left us in a situation where now the right can go after the compatible left. And if they're successful at that, what's going to be left? Well, full-on fascism. Because what we have now is a process of, it works better in French than in English, but fascisation, it's a process of fascicization, right? Fascism isn't just a thing that arrives when somebody knocks at the door or wins an election, or, sometimes, I should say, sometimes if somebody seizes state power, it can happen that way. But the way that it's been happening in a lot of the capitalist world is it's a process of consolidating power and moving things to the right. And if you go back in US politics, to the 1940s to today, the spectrum is going like that. And so the left wing, when people would refer to Obama as a communist or Biden as a communist, like, everybody should know full well that doesn't quite work when you think twice about it. But the reason they label him as a communist is what they mean by that is the most left-wing position available, and we want to destroy it. So let's apply our logic to anti-communism to the dominant left. And in that regard, we should resist that fully. Sorry that there's a lot in the question, so I always feel like I'm giving short shrift. But let's take, I asked people in Zoom to put their questions in the chat because I thought it would be better because of the fact that we don't have microphones. And so I am just going to read a question or two out loud if I can find the most recent ones. It looks like Alex Barnett asked, I really appreciated your talk. My microphone doesn't work, but I was wondering if the academy under capitalism seems to be so easily captured by bourgeois ideology, by the ability of the bourgeoisie to use its funding to dictate the dominant thinking in the universities. Should Marxists even bother with trying to participate in academia? If the Western academy lends itself towards moderation and faux radicalism, then should we all just give up on our careers and become union organizers, etc., and write theory in our free time? Why participate in a bourgeois institution, and what is the role of the Marxist academic at this stage of capitalism? I'm just going to respond to these one at a time instead of taking them in stack. So I think that it's a great question. My sense is that class struggle is everywhere, and we need to be everywhere. There isn't some area where we should cede territory and say, well, let's just give up on the bourgeois academy. It is forsaken. Bourgeois academy has incredible resources. It gives you access to a lot of people. It has a real platform. It gives you academic credibility. And that counts for a lot. I mean, it's just the symbolic economy. But the fact that somebody's a professor or a brilliant intellectual who's not a professor, unfortunately, a lot of people think, well, they're different people. It doesn't make sense in my book, but in the book of most people, it makes sense. And so if you're able to be an academic and say, look, I have all the credentials in the world. In my case, in the case of French theory and critical theory, I don't know, including people who work in these traditions, people who have more degrees than I do or worked with more people who are famous than I do. Not to pat myself on the back, but simply to say, well, if you want to play the credentials game, I think I've got you on that front. And if I don't, let's have an argument about it because I studied very hard all of these things. And that does carry a certain amount of weight. The final thing that I'd say is that I do think that it's important that, especially in the world that we're living in, there's not room in the academy for everybody, and they're shutting a lot of it down. And so increasingly, there are going to be powerful and important intellectuals who are working outside of the academy. It's the nature of the game. And that is because class struggle is getting sharper, and they're coming down on it. It's important for all of us, and it's one of the elements of the critical theory workshop to realize or recognize we're intellectuals. It doesn't matter who's paying the bills. But if you can get the bills paid by the academy and be constantly within this more intellectual world, there are advantages to it. Ayabulela asked, how do you bring academics to the realization that we're a compromised labor force? Good question. I think a lot of it is through the type of conversations that we're hopefully having. And also, there's a way that people assume that bourgeois culture somehow functions according to different rules than other forms of consumer production and consumption. And all of that's just ideology. The academic world is an industrial world in which there are workers and there's consumers. And that logic saturates the entire world. And so I think it's very important to recognize that people in universities are workers and recognize worker solidarity and not allow that to be hijacked by the symbolic economy. A lot of people, graduate students are the best example, but postdocs and professors as well, somebody asks them to do some work and they're like, yeah, sure, I'll work, I'll do anything, which can be great if it's a collective project that you're invested in, right? But if it's just because a professor doesn't want to do work and wants to offshore it to some graduate students, it's using their labor and not having it be waged and compensated. This is how the art world works, for instance. There's a lot of uncompensated work because people want to make their way up in the symbolic economy. Therefore, they sacrifice their own labor to do that. We have to recognize that, no, these are labor relations. Let me just see if there's another. I don't see question marks. Okay, so Maria asked, can you recommend credible sources that examine Herbert Marcuse's involvement with the U.S. government institutions? I want to ensure I'm engaging with his legacy. There's this guy who has a forthcoming book he's the guy who everybody calls a conspiracy theorist and is kind of discredited. Rockhill, that's it. Gabriel Rockhill has a forthcoming book called Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism that goes into great detail. I think the Marcuse chapter has about 180 footnotes. So I'm sure it won't satisfy everyone and will be called out for being under-researched because it was only has footnotes in German and French and English and Spanish. But that is the main work that I recommend, only insofar as in my own scholarship I've drawn on a lot of other work and put it in the footnotes so that people could follow the footnotes and find the good work that I'm drawing on. And Tim Mueller's book, we interviewed him for the Critical Theory Workshop, and there's a YouTube video of me interviewing Tim Mueller, M-U-L-L-E-R, and umlaut over the U. That's in English, and it's a kind of summary of some of his work. His political horizons are a little bit different than mine, but the scholarship is impeccable. So I highly recommend his work, and if you don't read German, then check that out. I think the others are comments, so maybe we should do. Oh wait, we have one other from Gabriella, and then we'll do another round in here. According to your research, have you found any links, connections between those who funded French theory and the neoliberal thought collective? I'm thinking in the recent publication of Slobodian's Hayek Bastards. According to your experience, how should we approach the teaching of French theory? I mean, in terms of teaching practices. That book I'm familiar with. I haven't read it, and so I can't really speak to that. But it's very clear that the overall networks that were funding and supporting and promoting neoliberal economics are the same networks that were supporting a lot of the things that I'm talking about. Hayek, for instance, was involved in the networks of the Congress for Cultural Freedom that was funded by Ford, Rockefeller, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And that whole kind of network, Karl Popper, someone else who was bound up in those networks in various ways. And so, and as far as how to teach French theory, I've been doing my best, so hopefully I'm modeling something that might be carried forth. But given that my approach might be a little bit more either polemical or in your face, other ways of approaching it, I think basically would consist in always making sure that one doesn't engage in intellectual commodity fetishism by isolating the thinkers from the broader material relations within which they operate, and doing the hard work. The reason a lot of people don't do it is because it's harder. Much easier to do textual analysis. Oh, I read closely. Okay, well, you read one book. What about reading all of the other books that explain why, where, when, how that book was written, who funded it, why it was translated, etc.? Do the hard work of not only doing theory work, but history, political economy, sociology, everything else that goes into understanding the social totality. There's one last question. What is the line between reductivism and eclecticism that dilutes Marxism, of stretching Marxism but not breaking it? In what ways is it malleable? Does it begin or end at materially, rhetorically supporting AES? It's a really interesting question because there are ways that the Western Marxist tradition is quintessentially eclectic. The basic line in Western Marxism is, well, Marxism is all fine and well on the condition that you combine it with some bourgeois theory. Meaning, you mix Marx with Freud, you mix Marx with Lacan, you mix it with other theoretical traditions that aren't rooted in the collective contributions of the dialectical and historical materialist tradition, and that this will make it better, because there are things that Marxism has been blind to, has been unaware of, and other such things. That eclecticism, as Walter Rodney has, I think, incisively written, is problematic because if you just think for a moment about how science operates, and science not in terms of this positivistic bogeyman, but science being the attempt to say something true about the world and have that truth be verifiable because it works itself out in practice. That is very important for the process of distinguishing itself from that which is not science, that which is ascientific or irrational. And so if you say that, well, some people think 2 + 2 = 4, these people think it equals 5, but we should work mathematically together because it will enrich the differential perspectives we'll have on mathematics to have some untrue mathematics with some true mathematics. That doesn't really make sense. And if you understand that Marxism is a science, again, not like mathematics is a science, it is attempting to develop the most coherent elucidation of the material world while recognizing that that elucidation is fallibilistic, meaning it's only true until proven false. In other words, all truths are provisory and need to be constantly improved, updated, and modified based on what works and what doesn't work. And so just bourgeois eclecticism, I don't think gets us anywhere. And Walter Rodney says, as I began to reference a moment ago, eclecticism is great because it draws on all possible paths, because if you're headed nowhere, it doesn't matter which way you go, right? So you can mix science and irrationality and superstition with science. But if you're actually headed somewhere and you want to figure something out, then you want to work with people who actually understand how the world works and who don't hijack it with irrationalism and superstition. That said, that doesn't mean that then Marxism should kind of set itself up as a fortress and wall itself out from all things. Lenin was categorical about needing to read and know everything that bourgeois knowledge has produced. And he was voracious. And it makes perfect sense because bourgeois knowledge production is the most advanced knowledge production in the history of the world, because it is the knowledge that, in one sense, it comes out of the most elaborated and developed institutions of knowledge production thus far. So there should be some things of value, and we should learn anything that we can from it. I mean, where does Marxist political economy come from? Among other things, it comes from a deep knowledge and criticism of bourgeois political economy, right? Those engagements are absolutely essential. But what you want is science, not ideology, so the engagement shouldn't be eclectic. The other thing that I would say, though, is the lifeblood of the historical and dialectical materialist tradition is innovation. The bogeyman of like, oh, there's dogma and there's just these things that are set in stone. Marxism's a method. In that regard, everything about figuring out how the world works and how to practically transform it is open for and influenced by very rich and ongoing debates. And so learning as much as one can from every sources, but then also seeking innovation at very high levels. In fact, one of the, I think, most important things that's going on in 21st century socialism, if we can kind of label it simplistically in those terms, or contemporary socialism, is that what you see in places like China and in Vietnam, it's very, very explicit, is a critique of what they refer to, particularly in Vietnam's case, of certain dogmatic trends within the extant Marxist-Leninist tradition that consisted in identifying socialism with a kind of egalitarianism of poverty. We'd have very little, but we'd share it all. And in an imperialist world, in which the empire keeps building and getting more powerful, if you just have an egalitarianism of poverty, then you're never going to be able to defeat imperialism. And so one of the incredible innovations in the case of Vietnam and China is the recognition that, well, if the goal is not just to liberate ourselves, but it's to liberate humanity from imperialism and thereby save the planet and humanity, then ultimately the class struggle that is currently being waged at the highest possible level is between the imperialist and the anti-imperialist forces. Therefore, what we need to do is develop the productive forces to a level that surpasses that of the imperialists. Otherwise, we're going to be crushed or we're going to lose in the long run. To do that, one of the key innovations is to allow certain forms of capitalist investment so that you could develop the productive forces and get technology transfer from the West. Technology is absolutely key to global class struggle. I mean, we see it now, right? Who has the rockets and the missiles, and who has the so-called Iron Dome that's being pierced? Technology makes an enormous, enormous difference. So you need technology transfer, you need to develop the productive forces, and capitalist investment and Western investment allows for that. And if you know the history of the Chinese and Vietnamese model, it's one thing that they've been focused on. Okay, bring some capital in, but all contracts that we sign, we want technology transfer. And then we can begin integrating technological developments internally so that we develop that technology ourselves. If you've been following what's been going on with DeepSeek or so many other technological developments, they are now, particularly in the Chinese case, outstripping much of what's being done in the West. That process is part of an innovative critique of certain limits within the Marxist-Leninist tradition. And this isn't because these people are saying, well, we should just throw out, the principles of Marx. It's because they recognize the primacy of practice. What matters is not ultimately, well, Marx said this or Lenin said this. These are very, very helpful reference points because these are brilliant people that made foundational contributions. What really matters is whether or not the ideas that we're working with have traction in the world and they allow for a development of power and an overcoming of imperialism. And right now, when you look at growth rates in China and a lot of other indicators that one could look at, there's something going on in the world that wasn't going on in the world, a few decades ago. And in that regard, that innovative element is absolutely key to everything that goes on in and I only point to those examples. You could point to the special period in Cuba. You could point to the ecological project and the organic kind of revolutionary farming that's being done in Cuba. There's lots of other examples that one could point to. But innovation is of the essence, right? It's really of the essence. But there's a big difference between two different types of innovation. One type of innovation is about branding oneself and one's ideas in the marketplace and saying, oh, I have a new idea. I have a new concept of politics. Oh, really? So we live in a world where one individual would have a new concept of politics that would somehow save humanity? I mean, people are quite full of themselves when they put themselves forth as this like gospel-like person. And if you look back in history, like when has that played itself out very well? Like when has there been one new idea that has revolutionized everything? And that type of marketplace exchange value oriented innovation is the exact opposite of people innovating because they're saying, hey, we've tried this out. This is the extant play of forces. Maybe we should try this out to see if it works and test it out in practice. And when the Chinese did the reform and opening up, that's what they did. They didn't say, we're going capitalist now. They said, we are going to try to allow certain forms of capitalist investment in particular regions and study very closely what works and what doesn't work, and we're going to change and adjust accordingly. And then we're going to expand what works, and we're going to contract what doesn't work. And we're going to keep control of the state apparatus, which is absolutely essential. Who controls the state apparatus? Is it the millionaire class? No, it's not. And that's essential. And we're going to control the towering heights of the economy, including the financial sector and the banks. That is a game changer. So it's also, maybe the last thing that I'd say, and then we could make a quick round of questions here, is that it's also important that the Chinese and Vietnamese models, you have to admit they're playing with fire, right? You have capitalists coming in, you have capitalist investment. It is playing with fire. There is no doubt. But socialists have never been able to choose the state of class struggle. They have it imposed on them. And right now, it seems like that orientation is one that has proven itself practically in a way that others have not. But let's take some, I think we have about 20 minutes left. We'll do another round of questions.
Yeah, I'm speaking, I was just brought up again about the need to maintain control of the state apparatus. And I think it occurs in attaining the control as well. So if we think about someone like Lenin, in the aftermath of the revolution, we do have a civil war, right? Pretty brutal retribution or putting down of other socialist groups, of a at least partially authentic Ukrainian separation movement, things like that. And then, I don't have my source for this off the top of my head, but I can get it. This is more to capture it quickly, but we can talk about it more later. There's a conference in the Soviet Union in the 30s after the purges and after some of the economic downturn and some of the famine. And there's a setup question, of course, because they know they need to address it, right? And the party officials are asked sort of why this has occurred if all of the policies have been put into place. It's obtained the power, it's done the thing, why isn't it? Why the negative results? And their answer was that the ideology is correct, and we know that the leaders know the ideology, and we know that the party leaders gave their orders in view of that ideology. Mm-hmm. And so any discrepancy in terms of the outcome is on those who carried it out, namely the peasants. Yeah. And so it seems in that moment, and this is
those carried out what?
Those who actually executed on the orders of the party, namely those actually changing the farming situations, those actually like living under the new system are failing to operate it properly. Okay. And then that's just to serve as an example of, it seems in that moment, the need to maintain the security of the ideological justification for having power seems to take primacy over what it's actually trying to deliver. And that seems like a problem that happens in general, right? So my question would be, how, as you try to think about overcoming some of the mistakes of past actual, socialist instances, how would you think about balancing the need to maintain that state control, the need to, I guess, anticipate and strategically outmaneuver other forces that would come in and try to get that control, while also not suppressing like newness, I guess, while also, and then not subordinating what's actually supposed to be delivered to the workers and to the people under that, right? Because if you need to keep control to deliver it, it's a difficult balance. So I was just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question.
Thank you. Just a little reaction to what you've said. What was fascinating is state apparatus of these foundations in the United States, which is linked with the market economy, which has, as you plainly explained it has its logic, and it would be very interesting to study it in various countries. For instance, in Germany, there are these foundations with strange name like Rosa Luxemburg's Foundation, for instance, but which played a major role. Just to give an example, but it's a different logic, because since West Germany didn't have an existence until 1949, just after the war, there was 5 years without any embassies. So these foundations played a major role. So they are very highly funded by the state. And some Polish activists explained to me that Rosa Luxemburg Foundation helped completely destroying the post-communist circles after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Poland and various Eastern countries. in order to back social democrats project. And you know what's very ironic? It's Rosa Luxemburg herself was killed by social democrats. Yes. So it's different. In my country, it's very state country, but that is owned by the bourgeois class. So when they want to help a book to be published, they can give you money to little publishing houses. It's possible. And the problem, if you don't do that, you have a disadvantage in regard with other little publishing house. And for instance, I was trying to ask for the right to publish, the help in publishing a book on Roman right, because as a Marxist, I think it's the normal way to understand the Roman Empire. It's a materialist way of thinking. It was good for anybody, for anyone. And they said, no, you are a Marxist publishing house. The state they told me, we will help you publishing Marxism. But I know what is help you publishing Marxism. It's only publishing Marxism that don't back the real socialist existing socialists. It's always the same thing. And when you, I explain me better what I've been living, because it's a part of the empire. But in France it's a bit different. But now I'm understanding it better, much better. They will. The Rockefeller can support a Marxist-Leninist project when it's suitable to their advantage. When the most important thing is to say what Deleuze said is all revolutions fail. And in French it was said with a slang word. It was a total failure. When you are able to explain that, that's perfect. You can be a Marxist. But at a very moment, at a certain moment of time, it was necessary. And just excuse me, I'm getting also just only anecdotes, but maybe it's very important to say, because it has a link with what you said. The last time I went in this building, I don't speak about 2 years ago with your theory. It was a Nicolas Tertullian explaining Lukács. Maybe you know it because you
took his seminars.
Oh, you went there. It was fascinating, but it was a genius from a philosophical point of view, but very weak on political knowledge. And he explained to me he had a lot of help from Raymond Aron and François Furet.
Carrément.
Yeah,
Really?
yes, making this seminar in this very building. Maybe you will accept who was Raymond Aron, who was François Furet. He was a French communist historian, and he became a very anti-Soviet. These people, and Raymond Aron was the major fighter against the enemy of Sartre, because they were twins when they studied together, and he was the man who was supported by the CCF and
he was the point person for the CCF. I mean, he was the philosophic face of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and is arguably the most well-known philosopher in France at the time, who is the conservative to Sartre's kind of left-wing position. A personal friend of Henry Kissinger as well. Aron isn't well-known in the United States, but he's a titan here. So that's fascinating.
So in this very building, it was allowed to study Lukács. Because at some moment in their strategy, Lukács had some doubts with the Hungarian socialist system. Of course, it's worth following. But at this very moment, it was a time when it was difficult to have little publishing houses. And for instance, The Destruction of Reason has not been published in French since 50 years. There were some lessons here, but it was impossible to have access in French to its work. So it says a lot about it. I think you helped me understanding it, because we are little part of the empire, and all what you expect, it was designed in your country, and thank you for
implemented here.
Implemented, yes, in a small part. It's true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you could make. Do I need to squeeze it?
No, don't.
I was wondering if you could make a few comments on the conversation surrounding revisionism. That's very common, especially nowadays online, when we're assessing the history of actually existing socialism, because there are many genuine attempts to try to understand what happened in the Soviet Union and what's happening in China now, and we're trying to assess is it opportunism on some areas, or is it just valid responses to the geopolitical environment of the United States, particularly in the early period, as well as today in China? And so I was wondering what your thoughts were surrounding that conversation.
Yeah. Well, great. In the interest of trying to get through this in time, I'm going to dive in and give a few answers so we can wrap up at 7, if that's okay. The first question, I think it's a very good one in the sense that there's a conundrum for socialist state building projects, which consists in needing to maintain the state while being under siege. As Michael Parenti, famously wrote, you don't have socialism set free. Never seen an example of it. You only have socialism under siege, and it's under constant imperialist siege. Therefore, it's not the socialists who have decided to have a strong state, it's the imperialists who have imposed a strong state on the socialists, otherwise they can't survive. In that context, it is integral to hold on to state power, but of course within the state, there's fight, it's not like struggle disappears after you seize power. Che famously said that the easiest thing about a revolution is making it. Which, of course, only Che could say that, right? And I was like, whoa, what a badass. Meaning that seizing state power is the easy job. Then figuring out how to build a new state, that's the real hard job. And remake society, the economy, and everything else. And in that play of forces within the state, there's going to be people pushing and pulling in different directions. And we'd have to have a longer conversation because it seemed like you might be alluding to certain things that I wasn't quite sure, but there's a way that the ideal socialist state will maintain state power, but nonetheless be anchored in, the Soviet case, in the Soviets, meaning the Workers' Council, and will have a strong democratic element to it, while it's nonetheless centralized. In certain instances, that's been more difficult than in others, right? In the case of the Soviet Union, you had war communism in the sense that the Soviet Union was invaded by 14 capitalist countries between 1918 and 1920 to, in the choice words of Winston Churchill, strangle the red babe in its crib. They wanted to fucking kill it because they didn't want the virus to spread. They failed, which is remarkable, but they didn't give up. They reconsolidated, the capitalist ruling class funded the Nazis, and the principal goal that Hitler outlines in Mein Kampf is destroying the Soviet Union. So they were coming back. Stalin knew that full well, and the communist leadership knew that full well. There's a famous quote from Stalin where he says, I can't remember the years, Emily, you'll remember, the West is 50 years ahead of us, and we only have 10 years to catch up, something like that, maybe 5 years to catch up. If we,
and 32, yes.
Yeah, and if we don't, they will crush us. That means that there was a strong, authoritarian, state-centered approach to developing the productive forces at all costs. And rolling back, as Millie alluded to earlier, rolling back some of the gains for women. They needed children because they needed soldiers. And it was brutal. I think that Lisordo's book is very interesting and solid on this, and any analysis of that time period needs to both uplift what was the attempts that were being made, while also pointing out the limitations and highlighting various criticisms. In that context, it's easy from our armchair position to say, well, there should be more democracy there. But when you're in it, it's very easy for the more authoritarian elements to, crack down on the more democratic elements because you're at war. And when you're at war, you're not in a classroom. And so it's clear that when we assess those contexts, I think we have to try to, as much as possible, understand the practical complexities thereof. It's been proven, as far as I can tell, that there was an internal conspiracy on the part of some of the leadership of the Soviet army, including with some people like Leon Trotsky, to ally with external forces, including in Nazi Germany and Japan, to overthrow Stalin from the inside. That context is very hard to deal with. And that doesn't mean that then you just, whitewash history and greenlight everything and say, well, everything that, Stalin decided to do was great. That's not the point, of course. But you have to have a balanced assessment. What you said was fascinating, Emmerich. I don't know if I could, comment on it other than to say that we have to have a follow-up conversation because they were running certain seminars here that were on the Soviet Union. and this actually might respond a little bit to the earlier question too, is that when you engage with Western Sovietology, you should know where it came from, who paid for it, and who's doing it. This is not objective science. This is a political project through and through. And Western Sovietology is largely an invention of the intelligence services. There's elements of truth in it, because they have to know what's going on in the East. But what is published publicly is often principally oriented towards slandering and demolishing it. François Furet was the president of the USSS, here, this institution. Raymond Aron ran a very important research center and was the principal reason why Pierre Bourdieu pursued his academic career. He opened many, many doors for Pierre Bourdieu and was an extremely powerful academic. And they were both rabid anti-communists. And Aron worked not only with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but with U.S. foundations in developing U.S.-style social scientific research in France as a weapon of war against the alternative approach, which is dialectical and historical materialism. And he happened to be the point person for the Institute for Social Research in France. All these networks are connected and overlap in various ways. Concerning the issue of revisionism, it's a really, of course, important point. Revisionism, if people aren't familiar with it, the basic idea is that there are fundamental tenets of Marxism-Leninism, and that certain actually existing socialist states have tried to revise them to the point of gutting them of their core substance, giving up on fundamental principles. And the Soviet Union has often been criticized, including by the Chinese, of revisionism. One of the things that's complicated about revisionism is a lot of people criticize a lot of other people for revisionist tendencies. And another additional complication is that it's not, at least in my opinion, the case that there are, there's not a set of principles written in the sky that just have to be applied. And the process of bringing socialism into the real world is one of theoretical and practical innovation, inevitably. And so sometimes accusations of revisionism are misplaced because they're actually just innovations. And I think that the real arbiter for that, ultimately, it's not theoretical, it's practical. And if there are changes that are introduced that lead in a direction that allow for greater development of socialism, even sometimes in awkward or strange ways, because as Lenin quite famously described, he said, well, when you want to climb a mountain, there are times when you have to go back down because you reach an impasse and find an alternative path. So the path to socialism isn't just, well, you just sprint to the top. When you go up, sometimes you have to go down, you have to wander around, you have to find another path. There's lots of different zigzags. But if in those zigzags you end up finding a way forward, practically speaking, then I think that it doesn't really make sense to call that revisionism. I think it is instead a form of innovation that is integral to advancing the socialist project in the real world. And in my opinion, right, the reforms that we've seen in both China and Vietnam are examples of really radical innovations, but they're opening space and levels of development that have skyrocketed beyond what we see in the West. Even just to the level of GDP. Like you compare European and US American GDP growth rates to what's going on in China and Vietnam, I mean, they outstrip, 3 to 4 times. That is the real issue. That's why the Pentagon's going crazy, is because there's overdevelopment of the global South compared to where those people should be, right? They should be in their place, and they're not. So they're complicated issues. The whole history of the Soviet Union, too, I mean, this would be another thing to engage with, but I think it is clear nonetheless that like some of the critiques of the revisionist elements I think are absolutely key for understanding what ended up happening in the case of the Soviet Union. That's why I alluded to earlier. There were external destabilization factors, no doubt, but there were also internal elements that were having it come apart at the seams. It's also one of the reasons why you can never, struggle's never over. Right now, I think that what China and Vietnam, I have some criticisms. I think that in general, what they're doing is charting out new territory and developing in really interesting directions. But in 5 years' time, a lot could change. There could be different leadership that would come in. These decisions could be revealed to be have different consequences based on historical perspective. So history is open. and it's all part of an ongoing struggle. Might be the best place to wrap up. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions, comments, and we'll